Hey folks, I'm Will Jarvis. Along with my dad, Dr. David Jarvis, I host the podcast Narratives. Narratives is a project exploring the ways in which the world is better than it has been, the ways it is worse, and the paths toward making a better, more definite future. I hope you enjoy it. Hey folks, this week on the podcast we have Freddie deBoer. Freddie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Doing all right. So Freddie, I wanted to get started. I first found your work. I actually read the book Cult of Smart, and I really enjoyed it. Can you give us just a brief background of who you are and how you kind of came up with some of the ideas in the book?
Sure. I guess I am a writer, and I'm not sure if I'm still an academic, but I have a PhD from Purdue University, which is from an English department. But I didn't study literature or anything like that. I studied writing and writing assessment, language testing, things like that. A lot of it was quantitative, a lot of research methods and things like that. And I wrote a dissertation about education policy, specifically about tests of higher education, but also about writing assessment at large. I was a teacher at the college level for 10 years. And anyway, so, years and years of being an educator left me deeply dissatisfied with the question of why we do things the way we do them. And becoming a professional researcher and writing a dissertation and reading all this education research didn't offer any answers either. So that dissatisfaction, the things that I discovered in that research and my own experiences became the book.
Excellent. And so I just want to get started with this is kind of a broad question, but in ed research, from what I've read, and I'm by no means an expert at all, but it seems that it's really hard to find any robust effects other than like maybe direct instruction or small group tutoring. Why don't we focus on this more in education?
So there's a few things. Let's talk about the size of the effect we're talking about. So,
okay.
In terms of a high quality, large meta study that demonstrates the effects of small group tutoring, the best and most recent one that I know of aggregates the effect sizes at about 0.4 of a standard deviation in terms of the positive impact of a small group tutoring. And this is specifically on low income children, but I imagine that we can extrapolate that to the population. 0.4 is, in the context of education, as you're suggesting, quite significant, and it's meaningful. But it is, typically you will see people estimate the size of the black-white achievement gap, for example, as a full standard deviation. So, education is a magic bullet world. Everybody wants to find the thing that will solve all of our problems. And tutoring won't do that. Also, you have to understand that tutoring is not sexy, right? Education is a field that is absolutely obsessed with the latest and the greatest, things that it seems particularly innovative, the obsession with educational technology, despite decades and decades of results showing that educational technology has no effect. So that's another reason. It's also important to say there's limited potential for money in small group tutoring, right?
Right, that makes sense.
You can start a company and you can hire a bunch of tutors and pay them $15 an hour. And you can insist they all have college degrees if you want. And you can put together this company and you can sort of sell your services to public schools. But that's not going to move the needle in terms of investors, right?
Right.
For startups now, the goal is to become a unicorn, right? One of these companies that has $1 billion valuation. And in order to do that, you have to excite the investor class. And that simply doesn't exist in the world of tutoring. Tutoring is something we've known about and have been doing for centuries, right? And so it's not as sexy as, I have a new app, and this app is going to change the world, right? The reality is that the app is not going to change the world. It's not going to change anything, but investors want to take big swings for the next Facebook or Google or whatever.
That makes sense. So it's just not profitable to start a tutoring company, but it is profitable to create like some crazy new app that you purport would really help education in this country.
You have to understand that there's just a deeply unhealthy set of incentives within our educational system. Okay. So education is, we've got the biggest layer is public school teachers who are unionized government employees, the vast majority of whom did not go to elite colleges. They are culturally and socially and economically quite distinct from the people who set the policy. The people who set the policy are a collection of, number one, academics, people who teach and research at major universities. They almost universally have attended elite colleges and universities. They make significantly more than the public school teachers. Then you have the think tank world. The think tank world is, there's almost literal unanimity among American educational think tanks in terms of what they believe. It is very difficult to find even an inch of space between them. They all have embraced a extremely sort of narrow vision of student success, which is built on student choice, which means charter schools, and chipping away at teacher tenure protections and eliminating the public school teacher union. These think tanks are funded overwhelmingly by people who are quite wealthy, or people whose foundations are quite wealthy anyway, and who come from business backgrounds, increasingly from the Silicon Valley backgrounds. These are people who are used to results because software problems are easier problems to solve, and so they say, "I'm going to send my engineers to do this, and we're going to do this." And so the effect of all this is that you have all this money filtering in, which is tied to the idea that, there is some individual problem in education, or some small number of problems in education. And because all problems are solvable with the application of money and engineering, we must be able to fix them if only we want to. What they can't countenance, what they won't believe, is that there are in fact some problems that are quite sticky, that are not, we do not have levers to fix, and that probably the best thing for us to do is to muddle forward with trying to find the least bad solution. But that is very much not the ideology of the apparatus that creates educational policy.
That's really interesting. So it seems like kind of what you're saying is policy in this country is essentially led by, elite education consultants who are far removed from on the ground teaching, for one thing, from the kids. And they're funded by, Chan Zuckerberg or the Gates Foundation, who think, if we only had this magic bullet to solve this one problem, like maybe we think teacher quality is a problem or something like that. I don't know. Then if we just fix that, we'd be done and education wouldn't be a problem anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is a broader American problem, but it is the thinking that all problems are problems of will, right? That any time that there's a persistent problem, it's because we have not decided to solve it, right? That we have not buckled down and just really exerted our will. And it's part of a country that, despite all of our endemic problems, likes to think of all problems as eminently solvable.
Interesting. That's a really good frame. I've never thought about it like that. And it somewhat explains why America has problems that the rest of the developed world doesn't have, and when we don't have problems that the rest of the developed world has, and this weird mindset we have. I want to talk about that mindset. I think it feeds in pretty well to the cult of smart. So what is the cult of smart? And maybe can you talk about that incident in your PhD program at the party? I think that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, sure. The cult of smart it means two things in the book. The first thing is it is a set of policy conditions and economic conditions which economically favor, as well as socially and culturally and politically favor, the interests of the educated. So it is the fact that in this country, when if you go back 50 years, from the end of World War II to say the 1980, there was a path to, if not what we would call prosperity, then at least to stability and dignity if you did not have a college degree. There were, jobs in manufacturing and in industry, which provided a living wage and often a union to improve working conditions, and which allowed people to have a wife, own a home, raise children, own a car, put some children through college. That way of life has largely disappeared. We're still a manufacturing powerhouse in this country, but the percentage of people employed in manufacturing has plummeted because we've gotten very, very good at automation in the manufacturing and industrial worlds. We build robots and they do things that humans used to do. There's also the influence of offshoring, so jobs going to Mexico and then to China. This is more controversial, but there's a lot of people who think that that's also a part. One way or the other, it's really difficult to have a replicable path to prosperity if you don't have a college degree. Of course, there are exceptions. You can be a movie star, you can be an NBA player, you can be a rock star, but those are not replicable things. You cannot, as a rational person, begin that path and think, this is going to provide me with the life that I want to live. And so that's the economic conditions, but also, you have political conditions. So the rise of everyone being involved with major political campaigns, being educated at elite private colleges. This is something that's really hard to quantify. But
is this a new phenomenon?
I mean, the extent to it is new. The extent of it.
Okay, gotcha.
I mean, if I was going to make an estimate, I'd say that it really ramped up in the 1990s. But
gotcha.
It was perfectly common in the middle of the last century for people who did not have a college degree at all to be, powerful bigwigs within the political apparatus of the major parties. That's certainly not true now. And so politically, the interests of the educated people are overrepresented, et cetera. So that's one half, just the structural ways in which the interests of the educated are favored in our society. But the other half is the cultural sense, the social sense, which is just that the obsession with education as being the only value, as being the determinant of someone's worth, the sense in which your educational background says deep things, not just about how well you did in high school or what you learned in school, but in this more nebulous but very real sense of sort of adjudicating who's got more value, right? So, even years and years after graduation, if you meet someone and you talk to them and you exchange where you go to schools, many people would detect a sort of weird and subtle and unchosen sort of set of feeling of, I went to Brown, you went to Yale, so I feel, part of me feels like, hey, Brown's the school that people who didn't get into Yale go to, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
That sort of thing, that pecking order is inculcated in high school, and it is people's singular obsession for years in their adolescence, right? I mean, the college rat race to get into a great college, it gets harder and harder every year, and it's, for many people, it has to be an obsession because it's so hard now, right?
Right, it's full-time job, crazy status game to get, you got to play all the sports, you have to get the test scores, you've got to speak 6 languages and start some nonprofit that does something, all just to get into one of these elite schools.
Right, and the thing is that this does not just go away when you get into a school and graduate, right? If you've been going through this gauntlet, where again, I think it's really, really relevant. It was really hard to get into a great school when I was applying to colleges in the late 1990s. But Now it's vastly harder because elite schools don't increase their enrollment numbers, but the population of American teenagers keeps getting higher and higher. So you're simply getting more and more and more people vying for the same limited number of seats, right? So you don't go through that process without it leaving a mark on you. And one of the things that it does is it conditions you to see, this is the arbiter. This is the thing that determines who I am. And as I say in the book, I think that this is expressed in a lot of subtle ways in American life. And so the story that you mentioned, I was at Purdue getting my PhD. I think this was 2015. And I was at a cookout with students from the second language program, PhD program. And there was a bunch of people there, most of whom I didn't know. Including some people from other departments. And there was a woman there. Her husband was a PhD student. I believe he was in a STEM field. I'm not remembering at the moment, but they're from China, and they had 2 kids, 2 little boys. And I was just milling around, and the mother was talking to some people, and the child, and the older child, I was walking by, and she was doting on him. She was talking about how impressive he was, how he was had the best grades in school, and how everybody thought that he was a prodigy, and how he was in a robotics club, already at his age, whatever it was, 9 or 10 or whatever. And then a little bit later, her younger son walked by, and he was being goofy, and he was like making farting noises with his mouth. And she said, "That one is maybe not so smart." And I clenched up. I saw other American people kind of clench up.
Right.
Kind of an awkward moment. Because in America, anyway, we don't say about our children, he's maybe not so smart.
Right. You would never do that.
You would never do that about a child, because that's just such an intensely negative thing to say about someone. Now, I can't say if this would be a common thing for someone in China. I have no idea. But she did not feel that this was taboo. She just felt, perfectly comfortable expressing that before a group of strangers, mostly strangers. And so, later on that day, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, why did I have the reaction that I had? Why did I find that that moment so tense? Why did it make me feel so awkward? Because, as I thought about it then, and as I think about it now, if she had said, he's just not an athlete, I wouldn't have cared. I wouldn't have remembered the story. If she had said, he doesn't have an ear for music, right? I wouldn't make any difference to me, right? If she said he doesn't have any artistic talent, who cares, right? But when you say that someone is not smart, right, that's different. That is an indication of their total value as a human being, right? And I reject this idea, even as I unconsciously am a part of it, because human beings have many values. We can be smart, and that's important, but we can also be compassionate. We can be creative. We can be patient. We can be loyal. We can be good friends. We can be good listeners, right? There's all kinds of ways to be valuable human beings. But I think both the economic pressure to succeed in school and the cultural association between education and value has created this situation where we speak in shorthand about human beings by reference to their educational background.
It's a really interesting way to frame it. I had never thought about it until I read the book, but then you start to see it everywhere. And you start to think, man, I just sized that person up because of whatever degree I saw on their LinkedIn profile, which school they went to. It's like, man, that's a really horrible way to think about a person. So what do we do about this going forward? I mean, it seems like it's such a complex problem, but like these elite universities, they're never going to, if you wanted to get, killed and you're the president of Harvard, you'd say, guys, we have the best education in the world. we're going to triple enrollment to serve all these other people. We've got this big endowment. They're never going to do it. All the values from the velvet rope. What's the path forward for higher education in particular?
Yeah, so I think it's important to spell out one of many reasons that Harvard would not do that is because truly elite universities are quite different from most universities in that most universities are tuition funded. Many of them
Gotcha.
get some amount of money from the state, but that has been declining for years everywhere, and now represents for most schools a pretty pitiful sum of money. So they are dependent on their enrollment, and
Gotcha.
the health of these institutions one year over another is just really dependent upon these weird minor fluctuations where if they have 300 more students or 300 less, that actually has a really significant impact on their bottom line because they're tuition dependent.
Got it.
Harvard is not, right? Yale is not. These institutions have massive endowments, as you mentioned, which are investment portfolios that they sit on and are in the tens of billions of dollars for the top schools, and they're fully capable of living off of those if they have to for a long time. Excuse me. Just the interest from those investments are likely more than many colleges make in terms of their tuition dollars in a year, but also. These schools are what funds the endowment, what keeps it growing is not tuition, but alumni donations and parent donations.
Gotcha.
So it's really, really important to Harvard that they be producing students who have the ability to pay into this endowment and keep the university growing, at least in terms of money, after graduation. And one of the easiest ways to do this is by selecting students who are already wealthy, right? So it's not just like you're going in. Like when people talk about the cost of attending Harvard as a rich person, right, of getting in. It's not. I mean, it's absolutely true that at most schools you can just grease the wheels with a large enough donation, and your idiot son can get into the school. But it's not. That's not where most of that money matters. The money that matters is on the back end, and when that idiot becomes an alumni who gets a job at an investment bank and can then make these donations, right? So,
got it.
Harvard's affirmative action program, they won't tell us enough about this for us to know for sure, but it's long been understood to be made up not of African Americans, Black students who are the descendants of slaves for whom affirmative action was originally intended,
right?
Are often wealthy Nigerians, for example.
Yeah,
and it
really sucks.
Yeah, for the exact same reason, right? Because they know that that's someone with parents with money, and that they'll be someone who'll be able to produce these alumni donations in the future. Look, what do we do about it? There's a few different ways to approach this. It's going to be really, you can't just change the culture with good intentions, right? I do think that if we got the word out among parents and were able to convince them that, ultimately you're hurting your children and other children by placing so much intense value on educational performance. When you force your preschooler to go through the process of getting into an elite preschool,
God,
some of which cost more than $30,000 a year, and have intense entrance requirements with various assessments that they've dreamed up. You are creating this understanding in that very young person's brain that your love is dependent upon their performance in school, right? And that I think we can tell parents, and we can ask them, model a concern with values other than education. I think we can do that, and that could have some effect. But ultimately, if this cultural situation is the product of the economic situation, only economic change is going to fix it.
Got it.
Unfortunately, I don't have a blueprint for how to fix the American economy. Look, it's big picture,
right?
Real simple. For most of the 20th century, productivity goes up like this, right? It rises, and wages, the line is the same line, basically, right?
Right.
As productivity goes on, real wages rise in concert with it. Sometimes in the mid 1970s, perhaps around there, those lines diverge. The line for real wages flatlines while productivity gains go up. And so workers, so people whose lives are dependent upon a salary and not on interest from investments, simply cannot continue to see their quality of life improve like their parents did, because the money simply isn't going to go to them. This is a big problem. It's deepening all the time, right? So, you see this in an extreme sense, like with like the gig economy. So
right.
People making very little money with essentially no benefits at all, and literally no permanent relationship with the employer, where the employer can let go of them at any time, right? So
right.
Kind of a bad employment situation on all fronts that is sold as being, this dynamic economy of the future, right? And of course, you have the spiraling inequality as the people at the top make more and more and more money.
Right.
That problem, I don't know how to solve. It's a structural problem that is not going to be easy to fix. But what we can do, what we certainly have the capacity to do, because this is the richest country in the history of the world, is to create a more redistributive model that squashes the top and the bottom so they're close together, and that lowers the costs, the risks of not doing well in school, right? So we could build a Scandinavian social safety net that provides for things like truly universal health care, housing credits, child credits for parents so that they can afford to have babies, the whole, sovereign wealth funds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like the whole suite of social democratic initiatives that are popular in the Scandinavian states. There's no reason we couldn't do that, right? It has to be funded with higher taxation. But again, we have filthy rich people in this country who are more than capable of taking a bigger haircut on with their taxes and continuing to be extremely wealthy. The advantages of this. Now, look, this is not my ideal system. I'm an anti-capitalist, not a reformer. But this system would one of the advantages of it would be, suppose you're a kid who strikes out in the academic ball game, right?
Right.
Suppose you're someone who, wherever academic ability comes from, whether it's at all genetic or it's completely learned or it's environmental or whatever, if you lose, right, in a system like the one that I'm describing, it's just the costs to you are far lower, right? If you lose in this system now, right, you might very well end up being under or unemployed iron worker in the Cleveland suburbs who's addicted to OxyContin and who survives based on disability checks.
Really bad off.
Yeah, and are living a desperate existence. Those are the costs of not the potential costs of not going to school, right? Because your income potential has been cut so dramatically. And I think that there are cultural benefits as well. So, Finland is one of these Scandinavian states with a significantly more generous social state than the United States. Finland is believed by many to be the most successful education country in the world. Their metrics are competitive or victorious in almost any measure that you look at. And yet, despite all being this amazing education factory, it's perfectly common for Finnish 5-year-olds to not be able to read, right? Really? In fact, it's perfectly common for Finnish parents to have never attempted to teach a 5-year-old to read.
Oh, no way.
It's
really
totally common in that culture. I live in Brooklyn. If some Park Slope parent, a couple of affluent bougie liberals, with their kid named Caden or Dallas or whatever, right. if that kid isn't like showing real progress at reading at 3 years old, they'll have there'll be a crisis for them, right? Like they'll be in specialists. They'll be
we're sending in the social worker, right? Wow.
And so for me, right, that demonstrates that we can dramatically lower the temperature of the academic rat race, make our kids less crazy, save millions of teenagers from this just brutal grind
Right.
of this system, and still produce good academic outcomes. I mean, what that shows me is academic excellence does not require, in fact, a culture that treats all of education as life or death.
Interesting. It does seem like we really do treat education as life or death in this country, and the battles over it are just so vivid. I wonder. So you mentioned, I want to go back a little. You mentioned 1970 as an inflection point for productivity growth and wage growth decoupling, and we talk a lot about 1970 on this podcast because it seems like there's an inflection point, and I wonder what you think about kind of the urban-rural divide in education in this country. So I'm from rural Eastern North Carolina, and if you cut off Eastern North Carolina at Raleigh, it would be the poorest state in the U.S. And you drive out, and there's like abandoned textile mills, and like the people, they look unhealthy, and there's a ton of problems. But then I live in Chapel Hill in Durham now, and it's this awesome place. And it's like this crazy divide between the haves and have-nots that I don't think was the case in the 50s and the 60s. I mean, there were plenty of other problems as well, obviously. But, what do you think what happened, or is there a path forward to fix it? I don't know.
I mean, look, so a few things that are important to say, right? We have, well, I guess I'll lay this out because we haven't said this yet. It's really important.
Yeah.
The general consensus opinion, if you stop a random person on the street and ask, how's the American school system doing? They'll say it's doing terrible, right?
Yeah.
They think that it's a factory for failure and that we just have terrible outcomes.
Right.
The reality is that the median American student, your average kid in American public school system, is doing pretty good. Not doing great, but doing pretty good.
Interesting.
Our top decile, our top 10%, or if you want to chop it up 5%, 1%, whatever, our top performing students are absolutely competitive with the best systems in the world.
Interesting.
If the United States, if there was some huge, big academic Olympics for kids and the United States had to just find its absolute stars, we would be absolutely one of the favorites to win it all. Where we suffer is that we have pockets of incredibly poor performance in some communities. We have people who are performing so badly, where the dropout rates are so high, the grades are so low, the attendance record is so poor, the standardized test scores are so poor that it pulls all of our averages down, and it also creates a perception of a widespread crisis when there really isn't one.
Interesting.
So there's that. This crisis happens in both urban and rural places. Okay, so
got it.
People have heard of horror stories about places like Detroit, places like Chicago, Camden, New Jersey, urban places. But there's also great academic failure, great academic problems in the greater Appalachian Mountain region, right? Or the Ozarks, right? The concentrated white poverty in the Ozark region. I think one thing that most people don't understand, we focus on Black and Latino students when we talk about education because that's where the gap is, and that's important. But it's important that people understand most of the largest piece of academically struggling students in the country are white students, right?
Just pure numbers.
If you had a pool of all of the kids in the country who were doing very poorly academically, and you just reached in and grabbed one out at random and pulled them up, the most likely outcome is that they'll be white. Now, of course, this is largely a function of the fact that this is a dominantly white nation still, even after years of erosion of that white majority, and of course the percentages are much
more skewed
among Black and Latino youth. But still, if we waved a magic wand and every Black and Latino student who is struggling now met standard tomorrow, we would still have a large education problem in this country because we have so many failing white students. So that's
got it.
for years and years and years, the money has been flowing to the cities. The people have been flowing to the cities. The cities have been sites of flourishing, and many of the places that are more not necessarily rural but more suburban areas or exurban areas have been suffering. So I grew up in Connecticut. Connecticut, when I was young, always had a reputation for great affluence, right? For being really rich. And there still are a lot of insanely rich people in Connecticut, don't get me wrong. But it's in a really kind of dire spot because there are no big cities in Connecticut that attract the kind of young people who are going to start families and grow the population the way that New York City does, where I live, right? What is powering so much of the progress in the country right now? People in urban climates, most of them who were not born in urban climates, moving here, starting families here, working for hot startups, and injecting new cash, new money, right? In Connecticut, the tax base is eroding because the population has increases slowed to a crawl, right? And structurally, it's really hard to see how Connecticut attracts that next wave of young people to inject, human beings in cash. Right? So I think that to the extent that there's a rural-urban divide in this country in education, suburban school districts probably still do the best on, when looking from 10,000 feet. Because again, most of the real problems are concentrated in extreme rural poverty and extreme urban poverty.
Interesting.
I don't think that there's two different sets of problems here. I think that the conditions that are hurting the United States are, in terms of education, are pretty universal.
That's super interesting. So if you ask a bunch of people on the street whether or not they thought we had an education problem in this country, and you lay those facts out in front of them, I think they'd be really surprised about the median student in the top 5 to 10%. But I think it does make sense. What would you do with the bottom quartile? What interventions? I have a friend, she's in Mississippi Teachers Corps, and so she's been teaching, she's getting her master's, and she's experienced, all the things you experience as first year teacher, second year teacher. And I wonder, they tried to put a lot of money behind the school, but for some reason, it's just, it feels like it gets sucked up by administrators, and, they're all driving brand new Audis through this like terrible building. And it's just like this crazy kind of experiment. I don't know. What interventions would you suggest?
Well, I mean, look, because I think many of these problems are social and economic rather than educational.
Just symptom instead of cause.
Right. I don't. There's not a lot of directly educational things that I think are going to create major change.
Got it.
One thing that we can do, as I was suggesting earlier, is no longer thinking that we have to have a silver bullet for all of these problems. Let's institute a massive small group after school tutoring program in this country for public school students. And if that moves the needle, 0.2 of a standard deviation in the right direction, then we call that a success, right?
Got it.
We have to change the parameters by which success is determined, because we've been swinging for the fences over and over again, and we've achieved nothing. I would also say that, I would get rid of the fairly recent dynamics in public education that have no evidentiary basis and are not working. So, two of the major interventions to try to address the education crisis in general and the Black-White Achievement Gap are standardization and standardized tests, right? So,
right.
Giving more explicit rules about how many instruction hours students need to receive in any given subject, how many hours they need to graduate from high school, what classes they have to take at some point in their career. So standardization in that sense, and then standardized tests, which, as everybody knows, Huge corporations like Pearson charge hundreds of millions of dollars to administer tests to see how well students are doing. Some students are in some places are taking dozens of hours of tests a year. It's important, really important to say, there is no reason to believe that widespread standardized testing actually improves academic outcomes. We have no good evidence that these standardized testing regimes actually result in better outcomes, right? If that's the goal, they are not justified in terms of reaching that goal. If you say, well, we need to know how well our students are doing, well, that's okay. We already can do that, right? The NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, many people will tell you is the gold standard of American educational testing. It tells us, because it's the best data about how well students are doing. The NAEP is a test that is not given every year, so students from every age don't participate. Okay, and it's not given in every school. It's given in samples, right? I mean, we have sampling, the ability to sample statistically, right?
Right.
We know how to get a representative sample and then to extrapolate from that sample to a population. It's one of the things that we are very good at when it comes to statistics, right?
Yeah.
Inferential statistics. That's what the inference is, right? Making that inference from the sample to the population. And so it's not necessary to test everyone all the time, because we have mechanisms that we can put into place that can find out that information. Yeah, go ahead.
So what's bad about standardization? Does it just suck up too much time? Is it not attuned to each student?
Well, I mean, I would say in the big picture is the problem with standardization is that it is dependent upon the obviously false idea that all students are the same.
Right.
I mean, the idea of standardizing a curriculum is to say we want all of our students to emerge with the same set of skills and with demonstrating the same abilities. But students don't have the same set of skills. They don't have the same abilities, right? They have profoundly different abilities by the time they're done with school. Standardization was instituted initially as a straightforwardly as a way to serve the industrial class and to create better workers, right? You want to standardize so that someone hiring for the factory knows exactly what everybody went through in high school, right?
Gotcha.
It doesn't serve the student, right? The student. Right. We know that standardization is hurting a lot of people because there is an absurd number of students in American high schools and American colleges who cannot pass key classes that are required by the standardized curriculums, whether that's high school or college, and who run up against the choice of either taking the classes again, sometimes for a third time, or dropping out and drop out. So,
gotcha.
In the book, The Math Myth, Andrew Hacker, who's an economist and political scientist, he talks about the failure rates of high school algebra tests. So high school algebra, particularly like the more advanced algebra for juniors or seniors, it turns out is just this academic Hunger Games that eliminates many, many, many people. So in Arizona, a few years before that book was published, Hacker's research demonstrated that 67% of students, of Arizona high school students, were failing their math requirement on the first try.
Oh, wow. Jesus.
67%.
Jesus.
Okay. So you're producing a system where you're creating a standard that most students can't meet. Right.
That standard.
Yeah. Yeah. And for dubious benefit, right? And so to me, that's cruelty, right? Like lower the standard, or what I would prefer. I mean, look, the other thing you can do is you can lower the standard, like you can make it absurdly easy to pass. So here in New York last year, something like around 70%. So we have the Regents exam as the high school like sort of standardized test that you have to take here. something like 70% of the students who taking the math section passed it, which becomes less impressive when you realize that they only needed to get 32% of the questions correct in order to pass it.
Gotcha.
So you can make a test that's hard, and you're creating human misery, and you're creating dropouts. We know for a fact that at both the high school and the college level, failing classes is the biggest predictor, or one of the biggest predictors of when someone's going to graduate, is going to drop out. Right. Failures drive dropouts is a fact. Or you can have a standard where you continue to have a standard and you talk a good game about it, but you can't get your students through it if you give them anything like a reasonable set, like a passing cutoff, and so you make a very low passing cutoff just so you can say students pass the standard, which of course is meaningless. To me, the far more intelligent thing to do is to replace that system with one that is more flexible, allows for more student choice. And so like these algebra requirements, look, I've never used algebra in my fucking life. Okay.
Exactly.
Since I graduated from college. I think it's beautiful. Obviously, at the standpoint of society, we need people who can do algebra.
Right. Yeah.
But we have a lot of them already, right? And they're really good at it, and I'm not, and I never will be, right? How about replacing that algebra requirement with a quantitative reasoning requirement, right? Which still involves math, which still involves thinking through the world with numbers, where you look at scenarios or situations and you look for patterns and data and you learn to interpret big numbers and what they mean and what they don't mean, but where you don't have this hours of rigid calculation that a lot of students just can't do, right? And it's also, and of course, you can tailor this to people who are graduating with certain degrees at the college level. Organic chemistry is just a serial killer in terms of changing kids' majors, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So many kids want to go into health professions and can't pass organic chemistry, right? Or related professions. Well, I don't want someone going to be a doctor who can't pass organic chemistry. So that's kind of a bummer. But the question is that class really necessary for the number of kids that we are putting these and this all gets into academic politics, because remember, like, departments want to have classes that pack the halls because it protects their funding and it gets them sections to give to their graduate students and et cetera, right? So a lot of these things, organic chem is just one of these huge classes that keeps,
chemistry department open, alive,
right? So I get where that's coming from, but the question is are these students really served by this? And if it's, for some places, it's part of the pre-health requirement is to pass organic chemistry. Does someone who wants to be a physician's assistant, which is like a technical position, it's not a research position, right? It's a position about learning skills, like how to suture somebody. That's that sort of thing. Do we want to screen someone like that out of that profession because they can't pass organic chem? So more options, more flexibility, more forgiveness of failure to meet standards, and reconceptualizing standards to say, our students are very different and always will be. How can we create a new system that serves more of them?
Gotcha. It seems like we've gotten really bad at treating people as individuals. It's all just like, there's this block of students, and we're going to do something to all of them, and just ignores individual variation, what someone wants to do, what they're good at, etc. In order to maximize their personal potential. I'm curious. I wanted to ask you a few overrated, underrated questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So Teach for America, is that overrated, underrated? I think I know how you'll respond to this.
It's overrated. Look, there is research that indicates that Teach for America students perform better than regular public school teachers. I don't particularly think much of that research methodologically, but we cannot build even if we took that at face value, we can't build a functioning public education system on the back of short-term tourist teachers who are
Right.
doing it in order to have something on their resume for when they apply at like Viacom or something, right?
Yeah, iBanking. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like that is not a stable
Equilibrium. There's not enough of them.
yeah.
Straight up.
Even if yes, there's not enough of them, but also like like there's something to be said for like continuity of practice,
Right. Yeah, definitely.
the
This guy's been
ability
here for a
to,
while. He knows what's going on.
yeah, and it's also I mean I'm the selection effects guy, and I think that so many of those different perceived differences can probably be explained by them simply teaching different populations. I mean,
Right.
I think this is a really important thing to grasp when we look at it, not just in the perspective of Teach for America. Okay, this idea that we're gonna replace all the bad teachers with new good ones.
Right.
There is no bullpen. We don't have a army of new, experienced, talented teachers to move in to where these teachers they want to get rid of are currently working and take over their jobs. Right? There's no bullpen. That does not exist.
Got it.
They're not going to work at the pay rates that teachers make. I mean, look, different people have different figures because the way this is calculated is often different. But the median American teacher makes something like $50,000 a year, right? For many of the kind of elite college graduates that people think should be going into teaching, this is simply not competitive in any sense, right?
Right. Why is teaching low status in this country? And it seems like the pay for teachers versus like attorneys and other professionals has just the gap has widened substantially over time.
Yeah. So I believe that in the late 1970s, a first-year Manhattan lawyer made about $1,000 more than a first-year Manhattan teacher.
Wow.
Today, a first-year Manhattan attorney makes about $100,000 more.
Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Manhattan. Look, it's low status because it was a woman's profession. Okay.
Oh God, Jesus, that sucks.
Teaching was what women did. Teaching, women's work is not respected. I mean that's probably the biggest reason right there. Look, it's low paid because it's funded with property taxes, local property taxes, and again, people always say, "Oh, we'll do this big bargain where teachers will lose job security, but they get income. They get a higher income." Well, if teachers want to negotiate for that, if their unions negotiate for that, and they make that decision, that's fine by me. But how are you going to do that? Are you going to dramatically raise property taxes across the face of the United States? Do you have any idea how incredibly hard that would be?
Yep.
It's just not going to happen. And the really important point is, people look at like success charter academies in New York, which has all these, supposed amazing outcomes. There's a lot of chicanery involved. They don't backfill, which makes their numbers look better than they
like weird selection effects on. Did they get to like pick their students and get rid of bad students, stuff like that?
So Successful Academy Charters does not backfill after third grade, which means that they have a supposedly random selection mechanism. I have my doubts, but they say that it's random. But students drop out of all schools. Students move on. They drop out. In fourth and fifth and sixth grade, Successful Charter Academy does not replace them. Okay, so if students leave, then they don't replace those students, which means that the students who are most likely to drop out of a school, to leave a school, to be most transient, are often the ones who perform the least well, right? So those students are leaving, and so you just get this magical uplift in your numbers. Hey, look, from K through 6, we've got this nice, upswing in our numbers, and we'll ignore the fact that X percent of our population dropped out. We never replaced them, right?
Right.
So that's an example. But let's say that the Success Charter Academy model is real and works. Okay, let's say that they've actually cracked it. Their whole model is based on extremely high teacher turnover of students who go to elite colleges, teach for a few years, and then drop out of the profession to go do their real job. Right?
Interesting.
These teachers are people who do not see themselves as career educators, no matter what they say. They want to go into jobs in entertainment or media or law or banking or whatever, but they have do-gooder aspirations, and they think it'll look good on a resume, and they sincerely believe that they can, raise kids out of poverty. They're willing to come here and not work for very much money in Success Charter Academy under the assumption that they're going to do something else. Right? They're willing to do that here in New York City, which is an extremely attractive place for a young, upwardly mobile person to live and to work. Right?
Right.
The question is, can that model possibly work in the Mississippi River Delta?
No, absolutely not.
Can that work in the Indian reservations in the greater Midwest, which have perhaps the worst educational outcomes of anywhere in the country, right?
Right.
Can this work in decidedly non-sexy places to live, like the rotting suburbs of Cincinnati, Ohio, right? Can you come? Are you willing to come and live in those places for 3 or 4 or 5 years and be a tourist teacher and then move on and then always have new people stepping in to churn into that place? So yeah, overrated.
That's awesome. That's great. Head Start, overrated, underrated?
Look, I would have to say overrated because it doesn't appear to work.
Gotcha.
I mean, people shout about this a lot. You can find people who will give you a long rationale for why this is not true. The reality is the larger, higher quality pre-K studies find that all of the positive benefits fade out quickly after you leave the program. The ones that people cite as evidence of Head Start's effectiveness are smaller, low-quality studies, which often tend to be much older as well.
Gotcha.
Right? From a data quality standpoint, it seems to me that Head Start is not justified in those terms, but I still support Head Start. Why? Because kids need safe, warm, nurturing places to be.
Absolutely. Right? Absolutely.
Like, if we're not going to get universal pre-K, free pre-K, under the auspices of like daycare, then let's just call it Head Start. I don't care.
Right. Whatever you call it. But have a safe place with some food for kids to go.
Right. But if you insist on justifying it with test scores, then number one, I don't think it's going to work because the evidence doesn't look good right now, even under the sympathetic light. And what's going to happen tomorrow if the test scores are even worse, right? Like when you create that justification, you say it's all about these growth numbers. Well, I hope it continues to work out for you. You know, like you're setting yourself up for failure.
That makes sense. Charter schools. I was interested in this. I was pretty libertarian in college, and I thought, man, if maybe there was competition, maybe things would be better. But it seems like in the data, they don't really have better outcomes when you account for things like selecting students and things like that. What do you think about charter schools?
Look, I think that selection effects. I wrote a piece years ago called "The Most Powerful Force in Education is Selection Bias," and I continue to believe that that's true. They always insist on the randomization of their mechanisms, but just a parent having the wherewithal and the initiative to sign a student up for a charter lottery is sufficient to ruin randomization. But also, like, you can't take them their word for it, right? These institutions have every reason, every incentive
not to.
Every incentive to misrepresent how they're selecting students. And there's been tons and tons of, I think 2014, Reuters, the news organization Reuters did a big investigation, and they just found charter school after charter school that was cooking the books and that was cheating and finding ways to mess those things up. Look, why would it work? Like you said, the libertarian argument, competition makes things better, right? If I own the only widget factory in town, then I don't have any incentive to make better widgets. But if you're a widget factory and moves in next door and you make better widgets, then I have to either get better or go out of business, right?
Yeah.
That's the justification. The problem is a child's brain is not a widget. Right? That analogy, like that thinking, assumes that teachers have direct access to manipulate child brains.
Got it.
It assumes that the outcomes of students are within the control of teachers. We know that's not true. Rand Education is a big neoliberal policy shop. They're very much in the pro-charter school, anti-teacher union kind of mode. But even they estimate that student side factors are 4 to 8 times more powerful than school side factors when it comes to determining student outcomes. Right?
Got it.
So yeah, you have a widget factory and I have a widget factory, and there are schools. Only the problem is
that's not what it is.
We don't get the widgets until they're 5 years old. We only have the widgets for 6 hours a day.
Yeah.
The widgets are made out of different raw materials. There are other people in the widgets' lives who are manipulating them and changing them, right?
Right.
All kinds of factors manipulate the quality and the value of the widget that cannot possibly be controlled by anyone, let alone by us. If you were trying to have a widget factory under those conditions, you might pull your hair out.
Right, exactly. It's too complicated. I had one more question for you. How did you get interested in education originally?
Well, I got a bachelor's degree in English from a not competitive public school, and I had it was in English and philosophy. I thought literature and philosophy were cool, and I still do. And then I spent the next 7 years of my life kicking around, living in different places, drinking and having fun, and working a series of completely pointless dead-end jobs. And I had a great time, but I didn't have any sense of what I wanted to do. And by the time I figured out that I needed to figure where I was going to go next, it was 2009, and we were in the teeth of the recession. And I just had a bachelor's degree in English from a non-competitive public school with no relevant experience, and I was trying to get a job, and no jobs were forthcoming. So I said, well, I guess I might as well go back to college, go back to school, go to grad school. And I ended up in a writing department at the University of Rhode Island because writing is the only thing I've ever been good at. And my graduate advisor and mentor, a guy named Bob Schwegler, was a empirical researcher. He at the time he was setting up kids who were writing with eye tracking technology to to measure where their eyes were while they were composing and editing. Anyway, and that was all new to me. Just the idea of being an empirical researcher and talking about data and numbers was new to me. So I pursued it. And as I said before, writing a dissertation about ed policy made me mad. And all of my experience with education told me that it was broken. So that's how I got interested.
That's awesome. Well, Freddie, do you have any book recommendations? I know we're going to put a link to Cult of Smart. It's excellent. I really enjoyed it. And I share it with all my friends. Your blog, that's another place we should send?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to frederickdeBoer.com. I occasionally tap away there. So I would say there's a book, if you want a book that I think will... that's nonfiction. It's about 10 years old now, but it's still very relevant. By Ha-Joon Chang, who is a economist. He is he's a liberal and a capitalist, and I am not neither of those things. But it's called 10 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, and it's just a series of not 10, 23 things they don't tell you about capitalism. And it's things like there's no such thing as a free market, and he gives you an explanation of why. Or one of my favorites is he argues that the washing machine has had a bigger impact on human civilization than the internet has.
Oh, really? That's awesome.
Yeah. But it's a really interesting book with a lot of counterintuitive thinking, and he's a very bright guy. So that's my recommendation.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Freddie. Any other parting thoughts?
Nope. Just look, I would just urge anyone who cares about these issues to consider the fact that we've had endemic failure for a long, long time in terms of solving the problems we say we want to solve. But we also have an incredibly narrow band of approved opinion. And that nothing changes, and yet we never inject any new opinions into that conversation. And so if anything positive is going to happen, it's going to come from greater diversity in the educational discussion space. It desperately needs it.
That's great. Thanks, Freddie.
Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.
Well, that's our show for today. I'm Will Jarvis.
And I'm Will's dad.
Join us next week for more narratives.